I am, of course, famously afraid of poetry and married to a poet. This is not an untenable position, obviously, because we are happily married and so forth. But I wanted to talk about why I think it's fear of poetry rather than a phobia of poetry, and why I think that it's rational to be afraid of poetry, for me at least. There was a time when I wasn't afraid of poetry. I am into, for example, W.H. Auden. I like Ben Jonson. Quite a wide range of different things. And also, there was a time when I was into mainstream literature and read, well, various things really. However, that time is now past. I should probably talk about temporal asymmetry at some point as well, because I'm not sure it's healthy to talk about things in that way most of the time. Now, the reason I think being afraid of poetry is rational is as follows. We are human beings. The distinctive thing about human beings is that we use language. I think that's probably the most important thing about us. That enables us to transmit culture, and it enables learning to continue through the generations and for us to amass experience as a species rather than just as individuals. There is a little bit of that in other species, but it doesn't sustain itself for as long as it does with humans. I happen to think that language is a lucky discovery of the human race and not something that's essential to our nature. But as human beings as we are now, language is essential to our nature. And yeah, I know about the fox gene and all that, that's not relevant. But language is essential to our nature as we are now. The most you can be human, therefore, is the most you can use language, you see, which is me not using language in a very erudite manner. So, whatever is the pinnacle of the use of language is the pinnacle of humanity. The more adept you are at the use of language, the more human you are. So, for example, you could say that Shakespeare is the most human of them all, if you accept that the quality of his work is very high. And the pinnacle, the epitome of literary language, which is the highest use of language, is poetry. Poetry is, in a sense, higher than mere prose literature, because it is a more creative and a more subtle and a more nuanced use of language than a lot of literature. Where literature becomes poetic, it is a higher use of prose, but poetic literature is better. So, if I can't understand poetry, and it's true that I cannot understand poetry, although there was a time when I could, that means that I am less human. And that's the most important thing about my identity, is to be human, because I am a human being. And therefore, the risk involved in attempting to understand poetry and to let poetry speak to me is a bigger risk. Therefore, being afraid of poetry is entirely rational, because to the extent you can't understand poetry, you are not human. That's how I see myself. I am subhuman because I don't understand poetry, and I will never understand poetry.